Good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum Studies Program's Museum and Practice Program, Access and Museums Making Meaning Through Online and Digital Connections. Please note that captioning has been enabled for this event, and if you would like to take advantage of this feature, please click Live Transcript button found at the bottom of your Zoom window. Before beginning the featured program, the Museum Studies would like to acknowledge that this university is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the treaty at the foot of the rapids, so that their children could be educated. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded, and today we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to our institution. My name is Deirdre Hennebury, and I'm the Associate Director of the Museum Studies Program. Along with Director Ricky Punzalan and Program Assistant Amy Smola, I'd like to welcome you to our Zoom space and to this afternoon's event. Since the webinar format does not allow us to see your faces and raised hands, we do encourage you to make liberal use of the Q&A function. The panelists will have time after the presentation to respond to your questions and comments. The Museum Studies program at the University of Michigan provides opportunities for students to integrate practical and research experiences pertaining to the complex world of today's museums. This afternoon's program is the third in our Museums and Practice series focused on museums, access, and accessibility. And this follows conversations exploring open storage strategies and inclusive practice in museum education and interpretation. This multi-year series was prompted by the expressed desires of students to learn more about accessibility and access in museums. An accessible and inclusive museum is one that welcomes all communities into its galleries, exhibitions, and programs. In its characteristics of excellence, the American Alliance of Museums, the AAM, includes accessibility in 3 of its core standards relating to a museum's public trust and accountability. These core standards emphasize diversity, access, and accommodations for all peoples. The AAM organizes diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion resources into 3 key areas: collection stewardship, education and interpretation, and facilities and risk management. For us today, all 3 categories, and particularly the first 2, encompass digital content and technology concerns. The AAM's position is that museums can leverage digital technologies across their operations to increase audience engagement and accessibility. A survey of research on inclusive museum practice highlights that creating an accessible museum requires an institution-wide commitment, a finding that will be underscored by our panelists. A museum must integrate accessibility into every aspect of its operations, from governance to education, to curation, to collections management, and so on. Our speakers today will share a range of perspectives on meaning making, access to heritage, and digitization, from collections management and museum cataloging processes and those inner workings of the museum, to questioning why, given that cultural institutions have digitized many public domain works and put them online, that few permit unrestricted reuse of these collections, and finally, to digital storytelling and online exhibits. Thank you for joining us. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our first panelist, Heather Dunn. Heather Dunn has worked in a wide range of museums and galleries across Canada and the United Kingdom. She completed a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Toronto, and her work as a heritage information analyst at the Canadian Heritage Information Network, CHIN, is focused on standards for the management and documentation of museum collections. Welcome and thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Everyone can see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I'm Heather Dunn. I'm a heritage information analyst with CHIN, part of the team responsible for nomenclature. And today I'm going to be sharing our experience with nomenclature and providing access to multilingual terminologies. So I want to explore some of the more unexpected challenges and opportunities that we faced in maintaining and providing access to a multilingual vocabulary. I'll present the solutions that we've implemented and also our wish list for the future of terminology management. And so nomenclature for museum cataloging, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a vocabulary and classification system used to catalog objects in human history collections. It's been available in English since 1978, thanks to the American Association for State and Local History, or AASLH. It's been used across Canada and the US and beyond by historic sites and museums and local history societies, cataloging historical and ethnological collections. And there have been 4 different paper volume, different revisions published as paper volumes, the last being Nomenclature 4.0 in 2015, and that's the cover illustrated here. Nomenclature currently contains more than 15,000 object names organized within a simple hierarchical classification system that groups like objects primarily by their functional context. And it's the result of an international partnership between CHIN, Parks Canada, which is the Canadian equivalent of your National Park Service, and the American Association for State and Local History. And the AASLH's Nomenclature Committee is responsible for the content of nomenclature. So although it was originally available only in English, it has been fully bilingual English-French since the first online version was published in 2018. In 2020, it was published as linked open data under a Creative Commons attribution license. So whereas before 2020, users could only search and browse nomenclature online, in 2020, users could begin to download Excel files or RDF files in various serializations. Most commercial collections management systems used by museums in Canada and the US have included some version of nomenclature to assist with and control data entry and to enhance search. In March 2023, so just earlier this year, we launched a Sparkle endpoint and some other linked data features to enable those software products to much more easily integrate nomenclature within their systems. And full documentation of the semantic model is available, and that QR code that's on the screen, if you scan it, it'll take you to that semantic model documentation. And we also have a lot of sample queries to provide some useful examples to get you started with Sparkle. And we're working right now on producing an API that will be available by the end of the year that will allow a lot of the most common functions to be used more easily. So, as I mentioned, French terminology was first published as part of nomenclature in 2018. The addition of French was the result of a collaboration between CHIN and Parks Canada and the Translation Bureau of the Government of Canada. And since that time, nomenclature has been maintained as a fully bilingual English and French resource. As part of the Government of Canada, CHIN has to produce all resources in both of Canada's official languages. And CHIN and Parks Canada have been involved in nomenclature's development for many years, even though nomenclature began as an American initiative. CHIN and Parks Canada have been involved for a long time to ensure that the terminology needs of Canadian museums are met. In 2018, for the first time, we began to make nomenclature more accessible for Canadian museums by including Canadian regional English and French terminology within nomenclature. So as you can see in this record for body armor, I've selected the Canadian linguistic variant in that terminology preferences panel near the top, so that my display will show all the Canadian variants, in this case, armor spelled with a U. You can see also here the inclusion of a Spanish equivalent from the Art and Architecture thesaurus. And this is accomplished by leveraging, excuse me, a match between AAT and nomenclature concepts. Wherever there's a match between AAT and nomenclature, we display the Spanish equivalent from the AAT and cite AAT as a source. So this, the Getty Vocabulary Program actually undertook that project to match AAT and nomenclature, and has included all of nomenclature's French terms in the AAT. So this has been a really nice collaboration to make multilingual vocabulary more accessible. So what language communities and other groups does nomenclature serve? As I mentioned before, nomenclature is fully bilingual, English and French. It's also mandated for accessibility that our resources comply with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG standard, so that they're accessible as possible for people with disabilities, visual and some physical disabilities. There's also interest among North American language communities to see terminology from their languages and concepts from their cultures represented within nomenclature. So as you can see here, the panel on the right of the screen is a continuation of the concept detail section of this boot record on the left, which shows the inclusion of the term for this concept, not only in English, French, Spanish, but also Inuktitut in both Latin script and the syllabics. And I'll explain a little more about that later. So some challenges. So with any multilingual terminology project, there are always challenges of semantics. So for example, when terms in two languages are not exactly equivalent, also challenges with the respectful representation of and access to concepts and terms from diverse languages and cultures. But for this presentation, I wanted to focus on some of the challenges and opportunities that were more unexpected that we faced in maintaining and providing access. I'll be talking about limitations of the data model and information systems, limitations of classification systems, and challenges for governance and community involvement. And so I'll address each of those topics in turn, and then talk about some of the solutions that we've tried or hope to try. So for managing the nomenclature vocabulary, we use a software as a service called Pool Party by Semantic Web Company. The data model is based on the Simple Knowledge Organization System, or SKOS. So SKOS is a flat data model, meaning that it can only describe one single thing, a concept. It's perfect for managing basic data about the concepts in the vocabulary, like the labels for a concept and the relations between concepts. And it's really great for vocabulary editors who don't generally have a lot of technical expertise. But the simplicity also has its downsides for complete representation of the data. With this simple SKOS model, we can't adequately manage data about non-vocabulary concepts. So we have things like information about the images, information about the contributors of terminology, the sources of terms and definitions, and things like information about the labels for the concepts. So for example, the grammatical gender of the French label. As such, the SKOS model was not adequate for the standardized semantic publication of all the information that we needed to publish about this vocabulary. So to solve those issues, we added some custom elements within our editorial system, which is Pool Party, to enable management of contextual information about the terms and the images. But while Pool Party allows the creation of any number of custom elements to manage this stuff, they're not standardized. So this poses another challenge for interoperability and access and integration. So to solve that issue, we added another graph database, GraphDB, as a publication repository to handle the complex standardized data structure beyond SKOS. So basically, we take our simple SCOS that's in our editorial model. We use an ETL script to do a transformation. So that editorial model in Pool Party on the left, and we transform it to the standardized complex semantic model in GraphDB, which is shown on the right, for data enhancement and publication. And that complex semantic model reuses existing data models like Dublin Core, schema.org, and so on as much as possible. So there you can see some of the standards that we use. We also had some challenges with language tags, which was a surprise. We thought this would be easy, but in discussions with the government of Nunavut about the inclusion of terms in Inuktitut, we saw that the SCOS requirement for a single preferred label per language was potentially problematic for them. The ISO language codes, which are used to represent language in RDF resources, only have the macro language Inuktitut and two sub-languages, Eastern or Western Canadian Inuktitut. And the government of Nunavut noted that even within that Western Canadian Inuktitut sub-language, there are many different dialects. So one language community speaking Western Canadian Inuktitut may prefer one term over another, but only one can be the preferred label and the others are assigned as alternative, which implies sort of a preference by the vocabulary publisher. So this may be an indication that further regional division within those language codes may be necessary. We're also required to use language tags to make nomenclature accessible. So screen readers, for example, require all content to have language tags so that they can properly pronounce words in any language for visually impaired people. And for the vocabulary content, that's easy because the terms are already tagged by language. But we must ensure that all the elements of the user interface for the nomenclature website, the GraphDB workbench, the Sparkle endpoint, everything has to be tagged by language. And we found this to be a challenge, particularly for content like bibliographies where, you know, a title might have words in multiple languages and there's no way to tag individual words, and also for Sparkle queries. And related to this, I just want to also mention about the handling of language tags in vocabulary management systems. If you're ever looking for a system to manage multilingual vocabularies, really carefully assess the capabilities of the system to handle ISO language tags. So most systems will manage the basic tags, but also consider handling of region codes. For example, that allows you to identify something like Canadian English or Canadian French. Handling of script tags, for example, Latin versus the default syllabic script for Indigenous languages. And customization to add more languages as needed. So the vocabulary management system that we used came out of the box with a very long list of world languages, but we had to customize it to manage Indigenous North American languages. Okay. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my slides. Okay. We also made a small change to one of nomenclature's oldest conventions. Because of a nomenclature convention that existed from way back in its beginnings in 1978, the other terms besides the preferred term for a concept were called non-preferred. Since from very early on in nomenclature's development, the idea was to encourage museums to choose a single standardized term, the preferred term for cataloging, and the non-preferred terms were only meant to point people to the preferred term. But we found that labeling certain terms which may be the preferred term in a given language community as non-preferred was sort of problematic. Again, after discussion with the government of Nunavut, we changed from non-preferred to call it an alternate or alternative term to be more respectful of and ensure access to the different dialects and regional terms used by diverse communities within one ISO language tag. There are also limitations inherent to classification systems. So any classification system relies on a principle of organization. There can be any number of ways of organizing the same group of concepts. So for nomenclature, it's based primarily on the original function of the object. But it would be interesting to explore whether this organization of terms primarily by function is problematic for certain communities, and if so, how those same concepts might be organized differently, perhaps according to one of the Indigenous worldviews, for example. But for now, the addition of needed terminology and concepts from languages and cultures across North America is our focus. So basically, this is about the challenge of managing multiple committees to ensure that nomenclature provides access to and is respectful and representative of terminology from diverse North American cultures. So nomenclature is continually developed and maintained by two committees. We have the Nomenclature Committee, has members from across Canada and the States, and it's responsible for approving new concepts and terms submitted by museums in English. And the Canadian Nomenclature Committee ensures that French terminology is included for each concept and that Canadian regional terms are added. So there's obviously a lot of communication between these two committees, and I am liaison sitting on both committees. And there are also multiple subcommittees operating, which are assigned specific areas of terminology to focus on for terminology development. And then subject experts in a particular type of object, for example, shoes or watercraft, will sometimes be invited to contribute to the development of terminology in their specific field. And a very important point here is that terminology is continuously submitted by museums and individuals from across North America and beyond, since it was first published in 1978, and throughout all the iterations since, nomenclature has been improved and expanded by inviting input from the museum community that it serves. So there are some challenges relating to the governance by multiple committees and the involvement of these multiple language communities, as you can imagine. We created a terms of reference document to lay out the roles and responsibilities for the committees. For example, the responsibility for English, French, Canadian regional terminology. And now that we've begun to include other languages, such as Inuktitut, we have had to think again about how decisions are made for those languages and who can make them. So as part of its terms of reference, new languages besides English or French can be added as long as there's a group that has committed to support and develop it. And any terminology projects to add Indigenous languages are initiated and driven by the Indigenous community. So we know that Indigenous organizations are often overwhelmed with projects and it's difficult to find representatives. And also, there is sometimes resentment toward museums among Indigenous communities, making collaboration on projects like this even more difficult. We now have the involvement of the Government of Nunavut on the Canadian Nomenclature Committee, and we hope to work with them to include Inuktitut terms for existing nomenclature concepts and add objects from the Inuit culture that are missing entirely from nomenclature. And we recently had another Nunavut organization has expressed interest in providing Inuktitut terms. So we're taking that opportunity to create an Inuktitut subcommittee that would be responsible for, the different dialects. And so, yeah, that's this subcommittee would then be able to make the decisions on the preferred terms for their language. So with any project, there are resource limitations, but for vocabulary management in particular, we found that although there are a lot of different vocabulary management systems from software as a service to open source, there's kind of a balance. Turnkey solutions are really expensive. They don't always include all the functionality you need. On the other hand, open source requires a large variety of specialized expertise and server capacity and other infrastructure. So some solutions could include using the tools for more than one project to get better value for your investment, or to create partnerships with other organizations which are also involved in vocabulary management. So partnerships can include not just financial resources, but also sharing of data and expertise and technical infrastructure. So speaking of partnerships, these are the ones that Chin has formed to help support nomenclature. I've already described the first 4 bullet points there, but we are also partnering with the Repertoire de Vedette Métier. It's a project of Laval University, and it's used by Canadian libraries for indexing in French. So they're collaborating with us on the French translation of the GraphDB user interface, and also working with us to co-reference nomenclature and our VM concepts for mutual data enrichment. Wikidata, we're enriching nomenclature through matching, and volunteers are doing that using the mix and match tool. Beinfrat, working with us to improve French terminology. NICLA, helping to ensure that nomenclature is respectful and meets the needs of Indigenous communities. And GraphDB and Pool Party were contributing to the development of the French interface for GraphDB Workbench, and submitting tickets for improving features on Pool Party. And the last point there is really important: collections management software vendors for museums. This is not a formal partnership, but more a collaboration. So we provide nomenclature data set and Sparkle endpoint and soon APIs, and we rely on the software vendors to make the nomenclature vocabulary accessible to their museum clients for use in controlling data entry, enhancing search, and data reconciliation. So we also had a lot of involvement from software vendors in testing nomenclature's linked data features as they were developed. So all this to say that partnerships for vocabulary development, for co-referencing, for software, for infrastructure, all of that is key to supporting multilingual vocabularies. And lastly, potential solutions. The first point there is about co-modeling. In the future, we would really like to see the communities that use nomenclature involved in data modeling itself, and not only in the content revision and enhancement process. The second point there is related, it's about flexibility. In many cases, when we work on decolonization initiatives or more inclusive vocabularies, we're focused on the terms, but the data model is never questioned. So it would be interesting to assess the nomenclature data model according to different worldviews, or to develop a flexible model to allow concepts to be arranged based on multiple worldviews. The third point there is about the CDOC CRM. And for those of you that are not familiar with CDOC CRM, it's the conceptual reference model developed by the ICOM Documentation Committee. And this provides an extensible semantic framework for concepts and information in the cultural heritage and museum documentation. And it's an ISO standard, it's a really important one. The Getty Vocabulary program recently adopted CDOC CRM as its unifying data model. And we were thinking that if nomenclature could reuse a similar structure based on the CDOC CRM, it would allow someone used to querying Getty vocabulary data to easily access nomenclature data as well. As I mentioned previously, some crowdsourced matching work is already done through Wikidata, mix and match. And term submissions to nomenclature are also crowdsourced from the museum community continually in a way, but there may also be other opportunities here. And of course, we would be interested in working with any language communities, particularly Indigenous communities, to add terms in their languages and concepts from their cultures. So that's it. Thanks for listening. And here's the contact information for the nomenclature team. And I'll turn it back to Deirdre.
Thank you very much, Heather, for sharing with us that very compelling presentation. So many questions. And one of the things that I found especially wonderful to hear from you is the level of collaboration, the many different groups that are involved in these types of projects. We'll move on now to our second presenter, Douglas McCarthy. He's a researcher, author, and advocate for open access to cultural heritage. An art historian by academic training, he has worked internationally in the Gallery, Library, Archive, and Museum, or GLAM, as we call it, sector for over 20 years. Douglas leads an international survey of open access policy and practice in the cultural heritage sector with Dr. Andrea Wallace, and he is the editor of the medium publication Open GLAM, which shares diverse global perspectives on open access. He lives in the Netherlands, and Douglas is the head of Library Learning Center at Delft University of Technology. Welcome, Douglas.
Thank you, Deirdre. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining, and greetings from a rainy and dark evening here in the Netherlands. I hope you hear me well and see my first slide. So today I'd like to talk about open access to cultural heritage, and I will focus mostly on digitized surrogates of public domain works, so works which are out of copyright or have never been in copyright. I'd like to highlight some observed problem patterns in the prevailing status quo when it comes to open access and digitized cultural heritage. I'd also like to highlight some positive case studies, some nice examples of open access delivering really positive impact for cultural heritage institutions and their audiences. And overall, I'd like to argue and hopefully convince you this evening for a mindful approach to open access to cultural heritage, and to say that it's a really powerful tool for audience engagement, knowledge development, and for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, or GLAMs, to fulfill their core missions. So without further ado, let's move on. First of all, a shared definition of open access in the GLAM sector, I think, is going to be helpful for us for this conversation. And the most widely definition, which I and many other actors here follow, is that from the open definition from Open Knowledge International, which in summary states that open means that anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share content for any purpose. Now, in practice, this breaks down here as demonstrated helpfully by Drake. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with the Creative Commons legal tools and licenses. And in a very simplistic way, for the benefit of brevity here now, what we see here is that CC0, CC BY, so the attribution license, and CC BY SA, the attribution and share alike license, and the public domain mark label, they are all widely accepted and agreed as being genuinely open access in this space. When you see non-commercial or no derivative, so NC or ND flavors of Creative Commons licenses, those, as Drake is illustrating, those are generally not accepted as being genuine open access, because those licenses are too restricting, they're too limiting for many kinds of common reuse. So the global picture of open access today, or open GLAM as it's often called, is as follows. We have recorded over 1,600 galleries, libraries, archives, and museums from all over the world, and this is a map generated from Wikidata, that have released at least some open access data from their collections. In total, that's over 95 million open access digital objects, which are available for you and me and anyone to download and reuse freely. And this information is sourced, as Deirdre kindly mentioned in her introduction, from an ongoing survey which Andrea Wallace and I have been leading since 2018. And the link is here on the slide if you'd like to dive into the full detail of a very large spreadsheet. It's worth pausing for a moment just to reflect on copyright law and how it reflects on this, on digital surrogates of public domain works. Again, simplifying for the purposes of brevity, the spirit of the law here, and this is from the UK, for example, is that simply creating a copy of an image, a simple digitization, will not result in new copyright in the new item. And the key phrase here is that copyright can really only subsist, it can only be in subject matter, for example, a digitized object that is original in the sense that it conveys the author's own intellectual creation. So particularly for two-dimensional 2D objects of cultural heritage items, which are public domain works often, then a simple digital scan or photograph is not sufficiently original to attract and deserve new copyright. This spirit is reflected in the most recent European Union directive. Article 14 of the 2019 directive really restates and clarifies that same spirit that material resulting from reproduction is only original in the sense that it's the author's own intellectual creation. So very much echoing the UK law. And in the US, this is dominated by case law, and there were some important cases referenced here, that a series of case law has essentially confirmed the same position, that the threshold for originality, if we're talking about simple reproductions of public domain works, is rarely met by simple digitization processes. And yet, what we observe very, very often, and this is the majority policy and practice in the GLAM sector, is that this spirit or letter of the law, whether it's case law or statutes, is often not upheld, and GLAMs often exercise their own preferences, their own interpretations, if you like, of the law. So the Arnefini portrait by Jan van Eyck, which is several hundred years old now, from 1432, is in the National Gallery in London. The gallery's very nice, but relatively straightforward reproduction of this work, according to the National Gallery, is their own copyright. So this digital surrogate is something that they claim copyright over. And furthermore, they attach the CC by NC, non-commercial ND, no derivative license to it, which is a very restrictive license, which only allows very limited forms of reuse of what is a digital surrogate of a very famous but well out of copyright public domain work. And the meme and the picture of myself here suggesting that the kind of common sense approach perspective on this is that when will, if not now, when will such an image become out of copyright? The current practice suggests that National Gallery could rephotograph, could redigitize in a similar way this work and enjoy a perpetual and everlasting copyright, which is not the spirit of copyright as it was originally created, of course. And to take another emblematic example, the copyright lovers or historians amongst you may know that William Hogarth Rake's Progress from 1735 was the first work, the first engraving to be protected under copyright law in the UK. And this work, this series of engravings, is very commonly held in institutions in North America and Europe and the UK, for example. And if we take a look, we use this as a sample to see how, particularly here, British institutions are licensing and handling copyright for this work. We see the following. On the far left here, we have Tate. They claim copyright in a straightforward reproduction, have a restrictive commercial commons license. National Galleries, Scotland in the middle, the same, and the British Museum on the right-hand side, exactly the same. So all of these are, according to these institutions, in copyright and licensed very restrictively. And if we look at the UK, other UK collections which have the Rake's Progress, one plate or more from the series, then it's very much the same pattern. The only and very happy exception is the Wellcome collection in London, which does not claim any copyright over their version of the Rake's Progress, and they have applied the public domain mark label to their digital versions. So free to download, free to reuse, genuinely open access. Now, if you keep this in mind, and then we look at the global picture, so these are a sprinkling of other institutions who have the Rake's Progress, who've digitized it and put it on their website, you can see that it's a very different picture. From the top, the National Gallery of Denmark, State Museum for Kunst, CC0 is completely open access, the Rijksmuseum here in the Netherlands, public domain mark, and so on down the list here, that it is a very, very different picture. And this is really symbolic of open access to cultural heritage more generally, that it's a very uneven landscape. Law is applied differently within and beyond different territories, different nations, different continents. And the way that digital content is labeled using Creative Commons or other open access or otherwise statements is also quite confusing, I would argue, for the general user. An extremely thorough report was published a year or two ago by Dr. Andrea Wallace regarding the UK, but very applicable to other parts of the world, that there is really no consensus, this is a direct quote, in the UK GLAM sector about what open access means or it should mean. And there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the public domain is, what it includes and what it should include. So this slightly confusing picture, I would argue, is very unhelpful for institutions, but particularly for their audiences. And on top of this copyright assertion, we often have a business model based on on control and desire for revenue generation from public domain works. This is the British Museum website. There is a price calculator, which if you ask it, you say, well, I'd like to take this Rake's Progress image, use it inside a textbook, one language around the world distribution, and a print run between 4 and 10,000 is my example here that I'm using, then the British Museum would like you to pay £179, around $200 I think, or euros, and that's quite a lot of money, I would argue, even for an academic, say, with the support of a publisher, which is rarer these days than normal. But also let's think about the kind of diversity and inclusion aspect of this. For anyone, for most people around the world, that could be more than a month's wages. So just in terms of the financial demands, what's being asked by these institutions for these digital public domain works, then they really are excluding a huge part of the world today. Overall, this has been described, this position, as a tax on scholarship and knowledge. Anyone who's active on academic Twitter or other platforms, this will be very familiar. The costs of research and publishing for knowledge generators, academics, researchers, and anyone else is very, very well documented. And this is a slide from Dr. Tess Mackling on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, where this is an excerpt from one of those very long threads where people share their frustrations and their challenges in accessing and wanting to reuse photographs from GLAM institutions of public domain works, the process of getting the images, the administration involved, the sort of the digital interfaces that are presented, and of course the cost of doing business in this space is huge. So this current status quo that I'm arguing is actively unhelpful to audiences. Now, one of the frequent cries that you would hear from GLAM institutions is that, well, we've got to charge something. We have to cover our costs by charging fees for images. Well, that business model, which has been in place since the analog era of transparency, is pre-digital. Again, I'm going to argue is actually broken and very counterproductive. So this is some information gleaned from Freedom of Information requests from several UK institutions to look at their balance sheets for image licensing activities. Are they generating a profit from what have just been presented or otherwise? The government art collection, huge and very important collection in the UK, stated that between 2013, 2017, they essentially made no money whatsoever pursuing this model whilst asserting Crown copyright. National Museums Liverpool from 2018 to 2023 have, hence the red figures, actually lost tens of thousands of pounds, trying to generate images from public domain works. The unhappy picture even extends back to the National Gallery, a small but wonderful collection chock full of masterpieces. Even the National Gallery is unable to generate a profit from image licensing activities. For example, in the financial year 2021 to 22, it lost over £30,000, trying to operate this business. So, zooming out slightly, and to summarize, one could say that this status quo is, in terms of copyright law, is legally questionable, but more fundamentally, it alienates key allies and audiences for GLAM institutions, people that want to access, use, and share their wonderful collections. It also takes up scarce human resources within institutions. In today's huge digital world, non-open access policies prevent wider distribution of digital content and knowledge from GLAM institutions around the web. It, I believe, conflicts with the mission of institutions, which are always about knowledge sharing, education, and benefit for society. And in terms of the fiscal picture, it loses money year on year, almost always. So the thinking face emoji is pertinent, I'd say. And to summarize this, Merete Sanderhoff from National Gallery of Denmark says, well, if it's difficult or expensive to get images of artworks from museums, well, people simply will look for them elsewhere. But there is another way, and to take us to the sunlit uplands, well, let's look at some case studies, some examples of open access in practice and its positive impact. Birmingham Museums Trust in the UK, and very nice, interesting collection, had been open access in 2019, using the CC0 waiver to rights. They provide access to medium and high resolution images, and their own testimony is that the profile of their collection has been raised hugely through open access, just in terms of press coverage in local and national newspapers and broadcast TV. They've estimate that's worth over £100,000 of positive free publicity. They've seen a huge increase in views of their collections online and image downloads. And again, within the institution, they have a much happier picture librarian and customers, and there's no more haggling over image fees. So it's a really kind of positive story. Crossing the Atlantic to Cleveland Museum of Art, also CC0 since open access since 2019. The benefits there are numerous. There's been increased updating of the attribution, provenance, and collections information. Their curators are forging new connections with scholars all around the world. Resources have been reallocated from responding to image requests to supporting digitization and improvement of the online collections, and mostly user self-serve from Cleveland's Collections Online. It's a great website, and that of course frees up really valuable staff time for more productive activities. Also, there's massively increased collections visibility. The collections have been used in articles in many different languages right across Wikipedia. Public and private partnerships is also part of the package at Cleveland, and here are just a few examples, logos on the screen. And this is really using partnerships to place open access content from Cleveland's collection directly in the hands of people who want to create, remix, and share their engagement with the collection and associated knowledge. Statens Museum for Kunst in Denmark have been open access for a little bit longer, very respected leading institution of open access here in Europe, and a very similar story, case study from their perspective. Also worth remembering and reminding ourselves that open access can also create engagement in physical, not just digital settings. So on the left-hand side here, we have a photograph of a local citizen science community called Wikilabs Culture that's been running for 8 years now. And this is where, I think it's every week, users come in, they get together, they have a coffee, get the laptops out, and they work together on, whether it's the school students or undergraduates or tourists or locals, on working with and developing knowledge from the open access collections for their benefit and, of course, for the benefit of the museum. It's a win-win. And to mention a library, the National Library of Wales, this is just a slide of the digital impact of their open access content in the Wikimedia projects, with some absolutely huge numbers, I think 1.2 billion views of their collections images that they presented and have catalogued in Wikimedia Commons. Those have been translated now into over 150 languages, which I find amazing. So this is really the power of open access content when it reaches the web in a mindful and considered way to generate new knowledge and engagement across cultures and across languages and around the world. So in summary, the benefits of Open GLAM, I think, is that it makes digital collections truly reusable. It drives inclusion for global audiences. It doesn't price people out through expensive licensing. It empowers education and creativity. It drives the reach of digital collections and the brands, the names of institutions. And it's transformative within institutions, for example, with smarter resource allocation, as we saw. And fundamentally, it supports the mission of cultural institutions, what they are really created for and what they say that they are about. Open access is a key tool for mission fulfillment. So we would like to move further forward and faster from the status quo to the happy garden of open glam. And I thank you for your attention. My term has now expired. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Douglas. Again, so much to consider, and particularly interesting to see these different examples from different countries, given that very uneven legal terrain that you're sharing with us. So I imagine that there will be some questions also for you. And I encourage everyone who might have a question to start putting those into our Q&A forum space for after Liz's presentation. So moving into our final panelist and her work, Elizabeth Harmon is the Virtual Museum Program Manager at the Smithsonian's American Women's History Museum. Currently, she is curating the museum's first digital exhibition and developing a long-term digital program. Previously, she was the digital curator at Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, and she created, in particular, digital resources about the history of women in science, with the goal of making women's stories more accessible online. Liz honed her interest in digital storytelling and history throughout her career. She completed her PhD in American Studies here at the University of Michigan, and I am very proud to say that she's also a graduate of our Museum Studies certificate program here. And she continued from Michigan to work in philanthropy and technology in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. So welcome, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm so glad to be here. And I think the last presentation I gave for the MSP program was when I had either just finished my dissertation or I was about to defend it. So I'm so glad to be back in different circumstances without that hanging over my head. So thank you. So, you know, first, I wanted to just start by making sure. Okay, good. First, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that the Smithsonian is creating a new museum. The place where I work. It is the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. And it already exists, actually. In 2020, Congress signed legislation to create the Women's Museum. And we are working hard to build that museum. And my apologies if my video freezes. My audio should be just fine. But you might just get an awkward face here and there. But in 2020, Congress signed legislation to create SWAM, the Women's Museum, and we are working hard to build that museum and welcome visitors to DC, and that'll be in about a decade or more. So in the meantime, we are in the process, and we have a digital presence, and we're launching a virtual museum. And you know, we want to provide online experiences and engage audiences around the country with programming, events, projects, and even digital exhibitions too. So, you know, this photo that I have up right now, it actually shows that in 1904, just the beginning of the building of the Natural History Museum on the Mall. And at that time, it would have been called the National Museum. But, you know, in the context of this talk, I just want to say this is an open access image. In the Smithsonian collection. When I was looking for an image for this slide, I wanted to find a photo of a museum being built. And so I went to Smithsonian's open access page on our website, and I searched for the image, and I got it. And I share that just because I think it's you know, I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about Smithsonian open access, even though that won't be the subject of my talk. But in 2020, the Smithsonian launched Smithsonian Open Access, and it allowed people around the world I don't need to explain open access now going after Douglas, but it allowed people all over the world to download, share, and reuse millions of Smithsonian's online collections. And to date, I think we've released almost 5 million digital collection items, with more to come. So by making our collections more open, I think part of the hope is to create new research opportunities, which hopefully is compelling for this audience. In a lot, hopefully, in my opinion, hopefully a lot of those research projects surface more stories about women in American history. And so I want to talk about one of the intellectual architects of this project at the Smithsonian. So Effie Capsalis really was the spearhead and the kind of intellectual architect between open access at the Smithsonian. She really made it happen. She passed away a year ago, but she laid the groundwork for really everything that's happening today at the Smithsonian with the new museum around women's history and accessibility online. And her work is more important than ever. So let me tell you a little bit more about her work in this area and how it inspires us today. And then after that, I'll transition to a little bit about a project that I started with Effie and that I've continued to work on. Okay, so before Congress created the Women's History Museum in 2020, in 2018, Congress and the Smithsonian created the American Women's History Initiative. And so this was before anyone knew for sure that the museum would be created. And the purpose of the initiative was to create, disseminate, and amplify American women's history. Now, Effie was the head of digital for the initiative. And she made AWA, we use so many acronyms, and I'm really trying not to use the acronyms, but I'm tripping myself up. I'm just going to call it the initiative. She made the initiative digital first. And now the meaning of this is really important for multiple reasons. One is the initiative didn't have gallery space at the Smithsonian, so it being virtual was really important. But most importantly, the initiative could have a much bigger impact by working across all of the Smithsonian's museum, archives, libraries, and research centers, which we have many of. And so there's this power. If you can work virtually, it's a wonderful way to bring together the power of all those collections together. So I'm going to feature just a few of Effie's slides. They're really beautiful, but also I think she did such a beautiful job of talking about the importance of this work around making women's history more accessible online and why it's important to be digital first in work like this. So, in my memory, Effie kind of usually started at this place where she reminded everyone that when you're invisible, people assume you've done nothing. And this is a quote from a curator at the American History Museum, Edie Mayo. And I think this is such a great place to start with women's history because, in the context of women's history, it can be really confounding because on the one hand, if you're an expert, women are everywhere in our historical collections. If you know people's names and networks and institutions and ways of searching, you're not going to have a problem in a lot of instances of finding great stories about women in archives. Now, there are going to be barriers and there's a lot of imagination that needs to happen too, especially with women of color in that history. So I don't want to minimize that either. But there is this idea that women are at once, I think, everywhere and nowhere in our historical collections sometimes. And that's because if you have the expertise to search and you know where to look, you can usually find something until you can't. But for other folks who don't have that expertise, it can seem like women are completely missing from our historical collections. Because if you try to use the search and retrieval method, you're not going to find much about women if you're using general search terms in a lot of databases. And so Effie had this beautiful example. The quality on this is my fault, the poor quality, but if you search the Smithsonian, your search results might look something like this. And if you're someone who's not an expert in knowing how historical collections are organized and accessed, this might be really confusing about how you interact with these hits around women's suffrage. but if you're more used to something like a Google search, right, with the structured information where you know what to do, you know where to go, you have your overview on the right, this makes a lot more sense. So in Effie's words, part of this problem also has to do with our search and how we're handling that as an institution across the Smithsonian. And so we can do better. And people are trying. But this is one way that, to think about this problem. I think, yes, another way to kind of think about this problem too, and the magnitude of it today, is to, remember that almost it's not quite, but almost 20% of Wikipedia biographies in English are about women. And it took Wiki Women in Red, a group that was identified this issue and has really focused on it and advocates and works to make this better. It took Wiki Women in Red years of working internationally to even up that number from 15.5% to 18%. So this is not something that happens fast. And this problem, it's important. It's really important because Wikipedia is feeding so much of our AI today. And so it's kind of reproducing this issue about discoverability of women's history online by giving the impression that women don't have as much of a history. And it also, another way to think about this problem is in terms of notability. So when Effie was organizing our early editathon, she'd been collaborating with the Wikimedia Foundation, I think, for far before in the 2000s. But she was hosting an editathon in 2016. She added Lois K. Alexander Lane to the work list, who created the Black Fashion Museum in 1979, and who should meet that notability criteria from an intellectual perspective. But in practice, Lois K. Lane's page was marked for removal. And you can see this in the history of the page for lack of notability. And in Effie's estimate, this was a problem. But I think one of the things that I'm really inspired about by Effie continually is this was an opportunity, I think, that she saw for historical institutions, for the Smithsonian, to play a role in solving this problem of making women's records more accessible online, their stories more accessible, by ensuring that we can add their stories to Wikipedia. So what role do museums have to play in that? Well, in Effie's words, her vision was to kind of create what she called a triple threat. And she imagined hiring digital curators, folks who specialize in machine learning, and folks who are experts in crowdsourcing and open knowledge work. And with that in mind, she said, then we can begin to help with this issue of creating new digital resources around women's history and making their stories more accessible. And so in her vision, digital curators would kind of continue to surface hidden figures and women in history to create that kind of, not just to do traditional curatorial work, but to create structured data and trusted digital resources, and then to collaborate with other folks around the institution. And then when we're thinking about machine learning, talking about analyzing that representation, improving our data, and then sharing those results at scale to improve that accessibility. And then with crowdsourcing, we're really talking about inviting folks in to surface the stories, to help us do that work, improve our data, and share the results. So I had the good fortune to be hired as a digital curator that was funded by the American Women's History Initiative in 2019. And I worked at libraries and archives to create digital resources and to make sure that women in science were discoverable in Smithsonian history. And I tried to collaborate across the institution to do that. So when I started, I inherited the beginnings of a spreadsheet that folks were calling, I don't think we were calling it the Funk List quite yet, but it was kind of like the spreadsheet of awesomeness, or people were really excited about that because botanists like Vicky Funk here, featured on this page, had been talking to Effie, working with folks at Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, talking about, okay, as we get started on this work to make women in science more visible in our collections, let's create a spreadsheet and just start noting, who do we remember? Who does staff remember? Because a lot of people at the Smithsonian have been there for a very long time. So they were asking, who do you remember? Who can we add to this spreadsheet and make sure that we know about their work? So I inherited this spreadsheet with a few entries. And then over time, we developed it into a structured data set. And to do that, I worked with a group of very talented interns over time, which was amazing. And I could not have done this without them. But B, we, before COVID at least, we didn't just work with digitized records. We had to work with records that were not digitized. The annual reports for the Smithsonian are digitized and they're available on BHL. So definitely check those out if you ever need to. But there's other fantastic collections that and the curator's annual reports will be digital. If they're not available, they will be soon. But the curator's annual reports, this is a type of document where if a woman may be a volunteer and not mentioned in a salary role or a phone book, you might find her in these curator annual reports, because these are head curators actually reporting on what a department is doing month by month. So you can actually get more precise staff information here in these curator annual reports sometimes than, say, these salary records from the secretary records at the Smithsonian that are detailing what someone's title was and how much they were paid on a year-by-year basis. So we're getting into these records, trying to extract names and information about people, in addition to mining online collections too. So, okay, sorry, I'm skipping ahead for a minute. Okay, so one of the cool things we got to do with this project, in addition to trying to create those resources online when we would learn about figures who we wanted to write about and create more records about their work in the science at the Smithsonian, one of the things that I did is I shared the Funk List with a group of data scientists at the Smithsonian, and they incorporated the data set into their own work. So they could look for instances where they could find more information about women in science, but also use it as to fuel their work, to see what are the problems with surfacing women in our collections and how can we do a better job. So the Funk List was really helpful with that, because we had this really high quality data set that we could give them, and we could work closely with them to learn more about folks on there. And then in addition, I had a chance to work with colleagues who were in open knowledge and to host Wikipedia editathons, to upload the data, some of the data from the Funk List to Wikidata, to make sure that as much of it as possible is available to folks online. We just didn't in cases where folks are living, for example, because of privacy concerns. But whenever possible, we did do that. And one of the kind of the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is the kind of an interpretive project that resulted from this work and this research on women in science. And so when Effie launched Open Access in 2020, she did a number of projects with cultural heritage institutions and different types of funders to kind of celebrate the launch and see what folks could do with our collections that were newly available for remixing and using and playing around with. And one of the partners we worked with was Google Arts and Culture. And so when we launched, when Open Access was launched, the Smithsonian released its collections data at scale with a public API and through a GitHub repository. So we shared that kind of collections metadata with Google Arts and Culture. And, we did that. And then we shared the Funk List too, this list of hundreds of women in science who've worked at the Smithsonian in history, to see what could we do? Is an experiment. This was with their lab project. So it was very much an experiment, and it was to say, what kind of tools might we build curators or researchers internally? That was the idea at first, to make better connections about women in our records and in our databases. And so, one of the things to say is one of the things I'm kind of taking for granted here in this time limited talk is this issue of why is it harder to find women's stories sometimes in collections? And I think while collection records and stories exist in abundance about the important early contributions of men in leadership, it's much harder to find stories about women's work. And this isn't unusual. In the early 20th century, in the context of women in science, when scientific and archival labor professionalized, historians have well documented how emerging scientific and cultural institutions prioritized the hiring of white men and the creation of historical records and their work and achievements. And as a result, you can see various barriers to surfacing stories about women's lives in our collections. So for example, Women's personal and professional papers are harder to find in archives and collection records. Women are not always identified in photographic records. Women were likely to work as contractors, even as volunteers rather than full-time staff in certain periods, historical periods. And perhaps most challenging of all, women's names change in written records. So due to marriage, the inclusion of titles such as Miss or Mrs. And the use of a husband's name all can make finding women very, very tricky in collections records as they were originally documented, or sometimes even worse, after they've been transcribed and digitized. Sometimes those titles, the Mrs. and Mrs., get scrubbed, and then you're looking at a husband's name alone, and they can get credit for their wife's work. So, I think the exciting thing here is that we have at the Smithsonian, there's over kind of 37 million records, if you think about it one way, in our online collections. And many of those records contain traces of these women's work. So it's about kind of finding that information and that data and being able to ask new interpretive questions. So, by mining that collections data, which includes information about scientific specimens, museum objects, artworks, library volumes, and archival materials in our collections, we can really piece together the history of women's work, for example, in the sciences at the Smithsonian. So with Google Arts and Culture, we use machine learning to mine Smithsonian's collections data to uncover stories about women in Smithsonian history, particularly women in science. And we use using the Funk List, Google Arts and Culture ran machine learning algorithms to identify named entities such as people, places, dates, in both the Smithsonian's collections metadata and the text of our annual reports. So using the named entities, data scientists created a network view to allow the relationships between those entities to surface and form a visual view. So Smithsonian curators' idea was that Smithsonian curators like me would be able to kind of browse among the nodes in this tool and make, hopefully, new connections about figures in history that they might know about. And so, looking at this, just a little bit of the so what about this project, and then I'll wrap up so we can have some Q&A. But, looking at the nodes data, it was really fun to see, to look for those relationships visually between in our collections. And I was able to tell some stories. And here you can see Mary Jane Rathbun's name, who was an early carcinologist at the Smithsonian, one of our first kind of women to do curatorial work. She frequently went to Woods Hole. This doesn't reflect this because of, well, I'll go into this in a minute, but it's not reflecting all of the other women that she worked with in various instances, but I was able to fill that in as I looked at this information. And it was fun to think about the other women that were at Woods Hole with her or in the area at the time. So, I think this gets to that other point I wanted to make there, which is this experiment was great in my mind because it forced us to grapple with the limits of gender information in our metadata too. People's names and records often haven't been thought of as relevant in museum documentation and even in the transcription process sometimes, various aspects of those names. So sometimes we don't have the names associated with particular records. And that can be a problem when you're trying to learn more about women in history at an institution. So that's a kind of important piece there, I think, that if with an experiment like this, having additional data that is more text rich and has that kind of can offer you a different, like those curators' annual reports that I was describing, for example, that could offer you more narration of what folks were doing would be really important. And I think this confirms the ways that women, are that they're missing in places. If their full names are not included, we can't find them. This was a really helpful kind of example of that. Folks I know who should be here, for example, with additional nodes, but they're not. And we can ask why. And so, I just say that this experiment also confirms for me that the work of historians and the kind of acts of historical research are absolutely essential to address issues relating to collections access and women's history. I think interpreters often have to know the names of key individuals and events to make sense of the relationships in the data, and they really have a critical role to play here in driving how we can solve some of these issues then, because they can see things that other folks can't. So, there's so much work to do to make women's history more discoverable online. And I think as Effie designed from the very beginning, you need multidisciplinary teams to tackle this issue today. And I think that's really the fun part. You need historians, curators, collections managers, data scientists, digital strategists, open knowledge professionals, and a lot of other people. And I think that's the good part, is that we all have a role to play in solving this problem. So I'll end there, and thank you again for having me. I'm excited for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Liz. And we have a few minutes remaining in our session for some questions. I invite our panelists to turn their videos back on. And we'll start with a question that's been posted on our Q&A. This is for Heather. And I hope that Heather, there she is, okay. Can you talk more about your perspectives on nomenclature's applicability to Indigenous items that have multiple function, roles, and life ways? Are there ways for a controlled vocabulary to reflect both Indigenous and Western worldviews, and what might this look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to answer that, first of all, I should explain that nomenclature as it exists right now is a monohierarchical classification system. So that means that each concept is situated in only one place within the hierarchy. So it only has one parent. So for example, a dress is a main garment. So one of the conventions of nomenclature, or the key principles, is the principle of cross-referencing. So that if you have an object with multiple functions, it can be classified in more than one area. So, for example, a wedding dress, for example, it can be classified both as a ceremonial object, so that it can be found with all the other ceremonial stuff, and it can also be classified as a garment, so that it can be found with all your clothing. So this, theoretically could make it possible for other worldviews to be represented just by assigning other terminology for these concepts. But it's, to be honest, we really haven't had any requests so far for reorganization of nomenclature according to any Indigenous worldview. I haven't really got a good sense of what that might look like. I think that would be something that we would, if there was an interest within the National Indigenous Knowledge and Language Alliance, the NICLA group, or our, for example, our Inuktitut subcommittee, for example, we would be interested to look at what that might look like. It's also important to note that, theoretically, these same concepts could be totally reorganized in multiple ways. It's really the vocabulary itself, so the concepts and the labels, really exist outside of their organization within this classification system. So, there's a real object, a dress or a chair or a boot in the world that we're thinking about, we're applying labels to in different languages, and how we organize that can be done in multiple ways. So I think that the content of nomenclature, the vocabulary itself, can be reorganized however we want. So yeah, I think that that's totally possible and very interesting to consider, but it's not something that I personally have any idea of what it would look like. I think that would be something that would have to be initiated sort of and led by the Indigenous communities if there's interest. So.
Thank you, Heather. And the next question, I think we might have multiple people that want to weigh in here, but maybe we'll start with Douglas, since it's directly an open access question. And Andrea Blazer is wondering if you could remark on how open access interacts with ongoing work towards Indigenous data sovereignty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think this is one of the most interesting and important developments in open access in recent years. It's part of Open Glam, I think, showing more maturity and growth. So there is a huge amount of work in various parts of the world in exactly this area, to say that, open access is not something which should ever be kind of applied with a kind of broad brush to many forms of knowledge, particularly, if you like, sometimes so-called traditional knowledge forms from indigenous communities, whether it's in New Zealand or it's in Canada, for example. And there is a lot of great work happening in this area. And just to highlight one that would be worth checking out for anyone interested and not familiar with it, I really recommend looking at the website of Local Context, which is localcontext.org, which is a global initiative which brings together and really kind of showcases good practice for cultural institutions working with indigenous communities to protect and sometimes reassert kind of cultural authority when it comes to data and heritage collections held in museums. And finally, I think, as many of us would know or maybe agree, that the copyright itself, being a very kind of Western concept, is really often not applicable and appropriate as a tool and a framework even for thinking about and managing access to these kind of collections. So thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. And it's interesting, in, of course, 3 very different presentations looking at this question of sort of access through digital and online means, sliced and diced in different ways. But there were a few themes that, several themes that emerged, and I think Douglas just sort of mentioned one, and Heather, of course, her work directly deals with sort of working with Indigenous communities. But Liz also mentioned this idea of crowdsourcing, and I'm wondering, collaboration, partnership, but this idea of crowdsourcing and allowing that the limitations of data, which I think, Liz, your comment about how your data and what's being mined can ultimately sort of reproduce those inequalities, that really struck me, as being such an important observation. I'm wondering if you could talk, Liz, and then I'd be happy to have Douglas or Heather jump into a bit about, like, what does crowdsourcing look like in this sort of online data mining, sharing of content?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just say this is my personal dream, but I think we need some staffing realities aside, right? Just like pretend that those don't exist for a minute. But I think, the Smithsonian, just speaking about the Smithsonian, we have a transcription center. So folks can, like many other cultural heritage institutions at this point, where folks can help us transcribe our records after they're digitized, right? And make them more accessible to folks in the future. And I think, there's really, I think, cool and fun ideas about ways that you could invite folks into the creation of either creating metadata or creating new data about collections that could exist in different ways too. So I think, and I know some people would say that sounds boring, right? Like, folks aren't going to want to do that. But I think you could. I mean, if I think the transcription center phenomenon, right? Like, I think is proof that I think folks are interested in getting into records. And I think if the significance of the metadata work was such that you could invite people into the process of thinking about how to make the records more accessible to more people, I think that could be a wonderful new program. But the staff required to launch something like that is also, you can think about it as massive.
Right. Yeah, it's a tremendous needed human resource to run such a thing. Heather, would you mind saying something too, just about sort of crowdsourcing and the kind of work that you've been doing?
Yeah. So Nomenclature itself, like, it's really, the whole thing has been crowdsourced since 1970s. It's been built with the, submission of museums and museum staff that need this terminology. But recently we had done some experimentation with Wikidata. So we loaded the entire nomenclature vocabulary into the mix and match tool, and then volunteers, some of them were just, out there in the world. We didn't initiate it, but some of them we had an organized kind of campaign to try and get Wikidata and nomenclature matched. That is still ongoing and it's slow, but it's a finite project. So it's nice to see as the matches happen, it's automatically updated, and that is something that I think it would be really nice to see more crowdsourcing, matching with other vocabularies beyond Wikidata. There could be potential for lots of other open source or linked open data vocabulary resources that exist out there in the world to be matched. We just don't have the capacity to tackle it. I also dream about having crowdsourcing of images to enhance the nomenclature records. Like, we have a lot of images already, but again, it's a really slow process. It's sort of, one by one, and a committee looking at them and putting them in. And it would be really interesting to see if there could be a way to crowdsource that work. And yeah, just continued submission of terms, I guess. I don't know whether it's widely known that nomenclature grows and is, developed through the submissions of museums. And it would be really interesting to, I don't know, have a more concentrated campaign to solicit more terms and fill in gaps, and missing terminology. But again, that takes a lot of manpower. Like, the committees are already kind of swamped with the existing term submissions. So we don't want to solicit more than we can handle. So, yeah.
Thank you, Heather. One of the, obviously the whole goal of this particular panel is to think about, the sharing of information, what terms we use to be able to communicate with each other and between systems. And, Douglas, in your presentation, maybe our final sort of question for our time together, it has to do with, you use the word sort of control, or the sort of the fear of losing control. And yet we've seen in some of that examples you shared, Douglas, and then of course Liz and Heather, you're talking about this crowdsourcing work, especially since the fiscal impulse seems to be misplaced. It's not earning these institutions the funds they might want through monetizing these materials. What remain the barriers, and what can we do as museum professionals to maybe start to remove some of those?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deirdre. I mean, one thing I'd say is that in my experience, like 20 plus years in the GLAM space, that the larger the institution, the more kind of drag there is on and fresh ideas and impetus for, if you like, leadership, often from, say, middle or senior managers around things like open access. Because often what we see in the open GLAM space is innovation happening away from the center, for example, in a regional library or regional museum, because in that scenario, you pretty much often convince perhaps your director, like one or two people. Now, if you're working for a national in the capital, there may be kind of the board of trustees and about 5 other committees. You have to say this is a good idea. So if you like, the opportunity and sometimes the support and energy for groundbreaking initiatives. And I loved seeing Liz reference Effie's work, is a dearly missed friend and leader in Open GLAM. That is hugely challenging, and I think it took Effie, if I'm right, Liz, the best part of a decade to move open access forward at the Smithsonian. So one of the main barriers, Deirdre, is that cultural institutions tend to, and sometimes usefully, but they tend to be quite conservative in their thinking and their policy making. So as a kind of spirited individual, kind of innovator within that kind of context, you really do need a lot of energy and support in order to bring these things for them to bear fruit, and that's not always the case. So the power of the status quo is sometimes how I sum it up. Thanks.
No, thank you. And thank you so much, Heather, Liz, and Douglas, for joining us for this panel, Museum Studies here at the University of Michigan. I certainly have learned a lot, and I'd like to thank the three of you for sharing your expertise and some wonderful kind of examples of this hard but important work that's happening in these different areas. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us for these presentations and conversation. So a very good day to some, almost ending, Douglas in the Netherlands, and others just starting, Heather out in Pacific time zone, and all the best to all of you. Thank you very much.